The sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the vast living room with its marble floors and minimalist furniture. Alexander sat behind his glass desk, his fingers locked together as he stared at the woman cleaning his fireplace. She moved quietly, efficiently, her uniform slightly worn but impeccably clean. Just like the rest of his mansion. He cleared his throat, and she turned, startled. "Mr. Reed," she said, straightening up, wiping her hands on her apron. "I didn't realize you were home." "I work from home on Thursdays, Mrs. Chen," Alexander replied, his voice cold and measured. "I mentioned this last week." She nodded quickly, averting her eyes. "Of course. I'm sorry." Alexander watched as she returned to her work, her movements now slightly more hurried. Elena Chen had been his housekeeper for 3 years now. Dependable. Thorough. Invisible, just as he preferred the staff in his home to be. But today, she wasn't invisible. Today, he had a proposition for her. "Mrs. Chen," he called again. "When you finish there, could you join me for a conversation?" Her eyes widened slightly, but she nodded. "Yes, Mr. Reed." 20 minutes later, Elena sat perched on the edge of a plush armchair across from Alexander. Her hands were folded in her lap, and though she tried to mask it, he could see the anxiety in her eyes. "How is your son doing?" Alexander asked, his tone deliberately casual. Elena's expression softened immediately. "Thomas is well, thank you for asking. He's excited about starting university next year." "Oxford, correct?" "That's quite an achievement." "Yes, he received the acceptance letter last month. We're very proud." A small smile played on her lips before fading. "But..." Alexander raised an eyebrow. "But?" Elena shifted in her seat. "Even with the partial scholarship, the costs are significant." "I imagine they would be," Alexander replied, leaning back in his chair. At 43, he had amassed a fortune that most people couldn't comprehend. His tech company had revolutionized security systems worldwide, making him a billionaire before he turned 35. Money had never been an obstacle for him. Not like it was for people like Elena Chen. "Mr. Reed, is everything all right with my work?" Elena finally asked, unable to bear the suspense any longer. Alexander's lips curved into what might pass for a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Your work is exemplary, Mrs. Chen. That's partly why I've called you here today." Relief washed over her face, followed quickly by confusion. "I have a business proposition for you," Alexander continued, his voice clinical. "One that could solve your financial concerns regarding your son's education." Elena's brow furrowed. "I don't understand." Alexander stood, walking to the window that overlooked the sprawling gardens of his estate. "I'm sure you're aware that I've never married." "Yes, sir. What you may not know is that I've recently been diagnosed with a rare heart condition." He turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "Nothing immediately life-threatening, but it has forced me to consider my legacy." Elena remained silent, clearly unsure where this conversation was heading. "I need an heir, Mrs. Chen. Someone to inherit my company, my fortune." His voice was matter-of-fact, as though discussing the weather. "And I need this heir soon, before my condition potentially worsens." Understanding slowly dawned on Elena's face, her complexion paling. "Mr. Reed, I'm not sure. I'm asking you to be a surrogate," Alexander stated bluntly. "I've vetted several potential candidates among my staff, and you are the most suitable. You're healthy, intelligent, and most importantly, I trust your discretion." Elena stood abruptly, her hands trembling. "This is highly inappropriate, Mr. Reed. I should go." "Before you refuse," Alexander continued calmly, "consider the compensation. $5 million, plus all expenses related to your son's education covered in full." No student loans, no financial burden. His future secured. Elena froze, her eyes wide with disbelief. 5 million. Plus healthcare for life for both you and your son, Alexander added. And a permanent position in my household with doubled salary, should you wish to continue working after the delivery. Elena sank back into the chair, clearly overwhelmed. Why me? She whispered. Alexander's expression remained unchanged. As I said, you're reliable. You maintain your health well. You've successfully raised a child who's clearly intelligent. And, perhaps most importantly, you're not the type to seek publicity or make demands beyond our agreement. Elena looked down at her hands. And the process? Everything would be handled through medical professionals. IVF with my sperm and a donor egg of the highest quality. You would simply be the carrier. His tone was so businesslike, he might have been discussing the terms of a corporate merger. Of course, you'd receive the best prenatal care available. Elena was quiet for a long moment, her mind visibly racing. And my role after the birth? Would be entirely up to you, Alexander replied smoothly. You could maintain your current position or accept a generous severance package and move on. The child would be exclusively mine, legally. You would have no parental rights or responsibilities. You mean I would give birth and then, just hand the baby over to you? Elena's voice was barely audible. Precisely, Alexander nodded. A clean transaction. A transaction, Elena repeated, a hint of bitterness in her tone. That's how you see bringing a child into the world? Alexander's expression hardened slightly. I see it as a mutually beneficial arrangement, Mrs. Chen. I get what I need, and you receive compensation that would change your life and your son's future. Elena stood again, more composed this time. I need time to think about this. Of course, Alexander replied, returning to his desk and picking up a folder. All the details are in here, including the proposed contract. Take it home, review it, discuss it with your son if you wish. I'll need your answer by next week. Elena accepted the folder with unsteady hands. May I go now? Alexander nodded dismissively, already turning his attention to his computer screen. See you on Monday, Mrs. Chen. Elena walked quickly toward the door, clutching the folder to her chest. And Mrs. Chen, Alexander called after her, not looking up from his screen. This conversation remains between us, regardless of your decision. Yes, Mr. Reed, she replied quietly before closing the door behind her. That night, in her modest two-bedroom apartment across town, Elena sat at her kitchen table, the contract spread before her. Thomas was at a friend's house, giving her space to think, to weigh this impossible decision. $5 million. Oxford fully paid for. Healthcare for life. The numbers were staggering for someone who had been living paycheck to paycheck since her husband died 10 years ago. Someone who had cleaned other people's houses and offices, who had taken on extra shifts and weekend work to provide for her son. Someone who had sacrificed her own dreams so that Thomas could pursue his. But to carry a child she would have to give away as if it meant nothing to her. Could she do that? Elena closed her eyes, remembering the cold, calculating look in Alexander Reed's eyes. He didn't want a child to love, he wanted an heir. A business asset. The thought made her stomach turn. Yet, as she looked around her small kitchen with its peeling wallpaper and aging appliances, as she thought about the mounting pile of bills and the daunting costs of Thomas's education, she couldn't dismiss the offer entirely. Thomas would be devastated if he had to give up Oxford. He had worked so hard, sacrificed so much. His father had dreamed of him attending university, breaking the cycle of financial struggle that had defined their family for generations. With trembling fingers, Elena dialed her son's number. Mom? Thomas answered, the sounds of laughter and music in the background. Everything okay? Yes, everything's fine, Elena assured him, forcing brightness into her voice. Just checking in. Are you having fun? Yeah, it's great, Thomas replied. Are you sure you're all right? You sound strange. Elena took a deep breath. Actually, there's something I need to discuss with you. When will you be home tomorrow? I can come home in the morning if you need me to, Thomas offered, concern evident in his voice. No, enjoy your time with friends, Elena insisted. Tomorrow afternoon is fine. After they hung up, Elena returned to the contract, reading each clause carefully. Everything was as Alexander had stated: the payment, the medical care, the legal surrender of all parental rights. At the bottom of the final page was Alexander's signature, bold and confident, alongside a blank line awaiting hers. The following afternoon, Thomas listened in stunned silence as Elena explained the offer, omitting some of the colder details of her conversation with Alexander. Mom, you can't seriously be considering this, Thomas finally said, his voice a mix of shock and concern. This is crazy. It would secure your future, Elena replied softly. No loans, no debt. Thomas shook his head vehemently. I'll get loans. I'll work part-time. I'll figure it out. You can't just be this man's incubator. Surrogate, Elena corrected gently. Whatever you call it, it's wrong, Thomas insisted, pacing the small living room. This guy treats you like you're invisible most of the time, and now he wants to use your body to get an heir? It's medieval. Elena couldn't help but smile at her son's indignation. It's a medical procedure, Tom. People do this all the time. Not for cold-hearted billionaires who see children as business assets. Thomas countered. And not my mom. Please, don't do this. We'll find another way. Elena reached for her son's hand, squeezing it tightly. I need to think about it more. I haven't decided yet. But as the week progressed, the reality of their financial situation became increasingly clear. Thomas's partial scholarship wouldn't cover even half of the costs. Loans would saddle him with debt for decades. And Elena's savings, painstakingly built over years, would barely make a dent. On Thursday, Elena returned to Alexander's mansion, her decision made. She found him in his home office, exactly as she had the week before. Mrs. Chen, he greeted her without looking up from his work. Have you reached a decision? Elena placed the contract on his desk, her signature now alongside his. Yes, Mr. Reed. I accept your offer, with one condition. At this, Alexander finally looked up, a flicker of surprise crossing his features. A condition? The terms are non-negotiable, Mrs. Chen. It's not about the money, Elena clarified. It's about the child. Alexander leaned back in his chair, studying her with newfound interest. Go on. This child deserves love and attention, not just wealth and status, Elena said firmly. My condition is that you commit to being a real father, not just a provider. That means time, presence, involvement. Alexander's expression hardened. I don't recall asking for parenting advice, Mrs. Chen. You're asking me to bring a child into the world for you, Elena replied, surprising herself with her boldness. So yes, in this instance, my opinion matters. They stared at each other for a long moment, the power dynamic between them momentarily suspended. Finally, Alexander nodded curtly. I intend to be involved in my child's life, Mrs. Chen. Now, shall we proceed with the arrangements? And so it began. Within a month, Elena had undergone all the necessary medical evaluations and started the IVF process. Alexander remained distant but meticulous in his management of the situation, ensuring Elena had access to the best doctors and care. As she lay in the clinic for the embryo transfer procedure, Elena caught herself wondering about the woman whose egg had been used. What did she look like? What were her talents? Did she ever wonder about the child that might result from her donation? Everything went perfectly, the doctor assured them both afterward. Alexander, who had waited in an adjacent room, nodded with satisfaction, as though a particularly important business meeting had concluded successfully. 2 weeks later, a test confirmed what Elena already suspected: she was pregnant with Alexander Reed's child. What neither of them could have predicted was how this clinical arrangement would transform both their lives in ways neither could imagine. The first few weeks of pregnancy passed in a strange blur for Elena. On the surface, little had changed. She still arrived at Alexander's mansion 5 days a week, still cleaned meticulously, still kept to herself. But underneath, everything was different. She was carrying his child. The morning sickness hit her hard in the 6th week. She found herself rushing to the bathroom in the middle of dusting Alexander's library, barely making it in time. As she knelt on the cold tile floor, a wave of doubt washed over her. What had she gotten herself into? A knock on the door startled her. "Mrs. Chen?" Alexander's voice came through the door. "Are you unwell?" Elena wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. "Just morning sickness, Mr. Reed. I'll be fine in a moment." There was a pause. "Have you contacted Dr. Montgomery about this?" "It's normal in early pregnancy," Elena replied, slowly standing up. "Nothing to worry about." When she opened the door, she was surprised to find Alexander still there, his brow furrowed in what almost looked like concern. "Almost. You should rest," he said, checking his watch. "Take the remainder of the day off. I'll have my driver take you home." Elena blinked in surprise. "That's not necessary, Mr. Reed. I can finish my work." "The contract includes provisions for your health," Alexander replied matter-of-factly. "It would be counterproductive to risk any complications due to overexertion." Always the businessman, Elena thought. Never genuine concern, just protecting his investment. "Very well," she conceded. "Thank you." As the weeks turned into months, these small, awkward interactions became more frequent. Alexander insisted on attending every doctor's appointment, sitting silently in the corner, asking clinical questions about development milestones and potential risks. He never asked how Elena was feeling beyond what was medically relevant. At the 4-month mark, Elena was organizing Alexander's walk-in closet when he appeared in the doorway. "The guest suite in the East Wing has been renovated," he announced without preamble. Elena paused, a stack of pristinely folded shirts in her hands. "I'm pleased to hear it, sir." "It's for you," Alexander continued, his expression unreadable. "Dr. Montgomery suggested it would be beneficial for you to avoid the daily commute in your condition. The room has been outfitted with everything you might need." Elena carefully placed the shirts on a shelf. "Mr. Reed, that's very generous, but I have my son to consider. I can't just move in here." "Your son is welcome as well, of course," Alexander replied, as though this should have been obvious. "There's a second bedroom in the suite. He could stay on weekends when he's not in his dormitory." Elena was speechless. The thought of living under Alexander's roof, of being constantly monitored like some precious vessel, made her deeply uncomfortable. And yet, the practical side of her couldn't deny the appeal. No more hour-long bus rides with swollen ankles. No more climbing 3 flights of stairs to her apartment every evening. "May I think about it?" she finally asked. Alexander nodded curtly. "Of course. But don't take too long. The doctor was quite emphatic about reducing your stress levels." Thomas was less than thrilled about the idea when Elena called him that evening at his university dormitory. "So now he wants you to live in his house like some kind of. It's a practical solution, Tom," Elena sighed, rubbing her growing belly. "The commute is getting harder, and the doctor says I need more rest." "I don't trust him, Mom," Thomas said flatly. "This whole situation is weird enough already. Now he wants you under his roof 24/7? So he can what? Monitor his investment? Elena winced at her son's phrasing, too close to her own earlier thoughts. The contract is very clear about my privacy and autonomy. A contract doesn't change who he is, Thomas argued. A cold, controlling business guy who sees people as assets. After much debate, they reached a compromise. Elena would move into the guest suite, but Thomas would stay there every weekend he could manage to come home from university, to keep an eye on the situation. The East Wing guest suite turned out to be larger than Elena's entire apartment. The main bedroom featured a king-sized bed with the softest mattress she had ever felt, a sitting area with plush armchairs, and a bathroom with a deep soaking tub that proved heavenly for her aching back. The second bedroom, set up for Thomas, was equally luxurious. "This is acceptable?" Alexander asked as he showed her the rooms, sounding almost uncertain. "It's beautiful," Elena admitted. "Far more than I expected." Alexander nodded, seemingly pleased with her response. "My housekeeper living in adequate conditions reflects on me," he explained, immediately undercutting any notion that the gesture had been born of genuine concern. Life at the mansion settled into a new rhythm. Elena continued her cleaning duties, though Alexander had hired additional help to handle the more strenuous tasks. She cooked her own meals in the massive kitchen, occasionally preparing extra for Alexander when she noticed he was working late in his home office. The first time she brought him a plate of food without being asked, he stared at it as though she had placed an alien object on his desk. "You need to eat," Elena said simply. "It's past 9. Alexander looked up at her, that same unreadable expression on his face. "Thank you, Mrs. Chen." That was thoughtful. It was the closest thing to warmth she had ever heard in his voice. As her pregnancy progressed into the 6th month, Elena began to notice subtle changes in Alexander's behavior. He started working from home more frequently. He installed a panic button system throughout the house in case she needed emergency assistance. He even replaced all the cleaning chemicals with non-toxic alternatives without her having to ask. But the most surprising change came one evening when Elena was sitting in the mansion's sunroom, her feet propped up as she read a novel. Alexander appeared in the doorway, hesitating before entering. "Mrs. Chen, may I join you?" Elena looked up in surprise. "Of course, Mr. Reed. It's your house." Alexander sat in the armchair opposite her, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. "How are you feeling today?" "Well enough," Elena replied cautiously. "The baby was very active this afternoon." Alexander nodded, his eyes dropping to her rounded belly. Does the baby kick often?" Something in his tone made Elena pause. Was that genuine curiosity in his voice? "Would you like to feel?" she offered impulsively. Alexander's eyes widened slightly. "I wouldn't want to impose." "It's not an imposition," Elena said, gesturing him closer. "Come, the baby is moving now." After a moment's hesitation, Alexander moved to sit beside her on the couch. Elena took his hand, his surprisingly warm hand, and placed it on the side of her belly where the baby was most active. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then, as if on cue, there was a strong kick right against Alexander's palm. His reaction was instantaneous, a sharp intake of breath, followed by an expression Elena had never seen on his face before, wonder. "That's remarkable," he whispered. "That's your child," Elena replied softly. Alexander kept his hand in place, feeling several more kicks, his composure visibly cracking with each one. When he finally withdrew his hand, Elena could have sworn his eyes looked shinier than usual. "Thank you for sharing that with me," he said formally, quickly regaining his businesslike demeanor. But something had shifted, however slightly. The next day, a top-of-the-line recliner was delivered to Elena's suite, along with a basket of pregnancy-safe lotions and teas. There was no note, but she knew who they were from. Thomas noticed the change during his weekend visit. "Is it just me, or is he being less of a robot lately?" he asked as they ate breakfast in Elena's suite. "He's adjusting," Elena replied carefully. "I think feeling the baby kick made it real for him." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "You let him feel the baby kick?" "It seemed right in the moment," Elena shrugged. "This is his child, after all." Later that day, Thomas ran into Alexander in the hallway outside Elena's suite. An awkward silence fell between them. "How are your studies progressing?" Alexander finally asked. Thomas looked surprised at the personal question. "Well, thank you. The Oxford program is challenging but rewarding." Alexander nodded. "Your mother speaks highly of your academic abilities." "She speaks of you too," Thomas replied, a hint of challenge in his voice. Alexander raised an eyebrow. "Does she?" "She thinks there's more to you than you let people see," Thomas said bluntly. "I'm not convinced yet." Instead of being offended, Alexander seemed to consider this thoughtfully. "Your mother is an excellent judge of character. Far better than most people I encounter in business. She also believes everyone deserves a chance to be better than they appear," Thomas added. Alexander's lips curved in what might have been the ghost of a smile. "That's why I chose her to carry my child." The words hung in the air between them, loaded with implications neither man was ready to fully explore. At the 7-month mark, Dr. Montgomery ordered Elena to begin her maternity leave. Her blood pressure had been slightly elevated at the last appointment, and though there was no immediate concern, the doctor recommended complete rest for the final stretch of the pregnancy. Alexander immediately agreed and informed Elena that her salary would continue as normal, plus the surrogate compensation. What he didn't tell her was that he had also rescheduled most of his meetings to virtual formats so he could remain at the mansion more consistently. One afternoon, Elena waddled into the library in search of a new book and found Alexander on the phone, his tone unusually animated. "No, that won't work," he was saying. "The nursery needs southern exposure for optimal natural light. Convert the blue suite instead." Elena froze. The nursery. Of course there would be a nursery. Somehow, in all these months, she had managed to avoid thinking about the fact that soon there would be a baby in this house, a baby she had carried but would not raise. Alexander noticed her standing there and quickly ended his call. "Mrs. Chen, do you need something?" Elena shook her head, fighting back unexpected tears. "Just looking for a book." Alexander studied her face. "Is everything all right?" "Yes," she lied, reaching for the nearest book without even looking at the title. "Perfectly fine." As she turned to leave, Alexander called after her. "Mrs. Chen." Elena paused, not turning around, afraid he would see the emotion on her face. Would you be willing to offer your opinion on the nursery plans?" His voice was hesitant, almost vulnerable. "I find myself somewhat out of my depth in this area." Elena took a deep breath, composing herself before turning to face him. "I would be happy to help, Mr. Reed." For the first time since she had known him, Alexander Reed smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes and transformed his face. In that moment, Elena caught a glimpse of the man her child might someday know as father, and something unexpected stirred in her heart. Hope. The nursery plans turned into a project that consumed Elena's days and, surprisingly, much of Alexander's attention as well. What had begun as a simple request for her opinion evolved into daily discussions about colors, furniture, and safety features. "Green is a calming color," Elena explained as they reviewed paint samples in Alexander's home office. "And it works well regardless of gender." Alexander studied the samples with the same intensity he applied to business contracts. "This one," he finally decided, pointing to a soft sage. "It reminds me of the garden in spring." Elena glanced at him, startled by the unexpectedly poetic observation. Alexander seemed equally surprised by his own words, quickly clearing his throat and returning to his computer. "I'll have the painters start tomorrow," he said briskly. As Elena's 8th month of pregnancy began, she found herself increasingly restless at night, her mind racing with thoughts she couldn't quiet. One particularly sleepless night, she wandered down to the kitchen for some tea, surprised to find lights already on. Alexander sat at the kitchen island, papers spread before him, looking unusually disheveled in sweatpants and a t-shirt, an outfit she had never seen him wear before. He looked up at her entrance. "Mrs. Chen. You should be resting." "So should you," she countered gently, moving to put the kettle on. "It's nearly midnight." Alexander ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of vulnerability that seemed out of character. "I've been reviewing the childcare literature." He gestured to the papers, which Elena now realized were printouts of articles about newborn care. "You're studying?" she asked, unable to hide her surprise. "I prefer to be thoroughly prepared for all scenarios," he replied, but there was an undercurrent of uncertainty in his voice. "I've run companies, managed hundreds of employees, negotiated billion-dollar deals, but this..." He trailed off, looking at the stack of papers. "This is uncharted territory." Elena prepared 2 cups of chamomile tea, sliding one toward him before settling across the island. "You're nervous," she observed. Alexander looked ready to deny it, then sighed. "Yes. I find myself concerned about my adequacy for this particular role." The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Alexander Reed, who projected nothing but confidence in every aspect of his life, was admitting self-doubt. "Every new parent feels that way," Elena said softly. "I was terrified when Thomas was born." "But you had your husband then," Alexander pointed out. "I will be doing this alone." "You'll have nannies, I assume," Elena said, sipping her tea. Alexander nodded, then hesitated. "I had planned to hire a full-time nanny. However, I'm reconsidering that timeline." "Oh?" Elena raised an eyebrow. "I've cleared my schedule for the first 3 months after the birth," Alexander explained, his focus on his teacup. "I want to establish a bond first, before introducing additional caretakers." Elena felt a curious sensation in her chest, something between warmth and pain. The man sitting before her was so different from the cold businessman who had proposed this arrangement 9 months ago. "That's a wonderful decision," she said sincerely. Alexander looked up, meeting her eyes. "I've been meaning to ask you something, Mrs. Chen." "Elena," she corrected gently. "After all this time, I think you can call me Elena." A flicker of something crossed his face. "Elena, then. I was wondering if you would consider staying on. After the birth." "Staying on? As your housekeeper, you mean?" Elena asked, confused. "No," Alexander replied, choosing his words carefully. "As a consultant, of sorts. You have experience with infants that I lack entirely. Your insights would be valuable." Elena set down her cup, studying him. "Are you asking me to help you with the baby?" "On a temporary basis," Alexander clarified quickly. "With appropriate compensation, of course. It would be a strictly professional arrangement." Of course it would. Everything was a business transaction with Alexander Reed. And yet, Elena couldn't ignore the plea hidden beneath the formal request. He was scared of failing this child, a fear she understood all too well. "I'll think about it," she promised, not willing to commit immediately. The thought of watching another woman raise the baby she had carried for 9 months, even temporarily, filled her with a complex tangle of emotions she wasn't ready to untangle. Alexander nodded, accepting her answer without pressing. "Thank you for the tea," he said, gathering his papers. "And the conversation." As he left, Elena placed a hand on her belly, feeling the baby shift beneath her palm. "Your father is trying," she whispered. "That's more than I expected when this began." What neither of them knew was that their carefully structured arrangement was about to be completely upended, in ways that would test them both beyond anything they had prepared for. The contraction started 2 weeks early. Elena was alone in her suite, folding baby clothes that had just been delivered, tiny, impossibly soft garments in neutral colors that she had helped select. At first, she dismissed the twinges as Braxton Hicks, the false contractions she had experienced with Thomas. But when her water broke an hour later, panic set in. Alexander was in the city for a meeting. Thomas was at university. And the baby was coming now. With shaking hands, Elena pressed the panic button Alexander had installed. Within minutes, his security team was at her door, efficiently executing the birth plan that had been rehearsed multiple times. One called the doctor, another prepared the car, a third helped Elena to her feet. "Call Mr. Reed," Elena managed between contractions. "Please." In the car, pain crashed over her in waves. The security guard beside her looked terrified, helplessly offering his hand, which Elena squeezed mercilessly with each contraction. When they arrived at the private hospital Alexander had arranged, everything became a blur of white corridors and medical staff. Dr. Montgomery met them at the entrance, her calm presence a relief. "The baby's coming fast," she informed Elena after a quick examination in the delivery room. "No time for an epidural, I'm afraid." Elena nodded, gritting her teeth as another contraction seized her. "Where's Mr. Reed has been notified," a nurse assured her. "He's on his way." But the baby wouldn't wait. 20 minutes later, as Elena pushed with all her strength, there was still no sign of Alexander. A strange sense of betrayal washed over her. After all these months, after all the tiny changes and moments of connection, he wasn't here for the most important moment. "One more push," Dr. Montgomery encouraged. Elena gathered her remaining strength and pushed. The room filled with the strong, indignant cry of a newborn. "It's a girl," Dr. Montgomery announced, placing the squirming, red-faced infant on Elena's chest. "A beautiful, healthy girl." Elena stared down at the tiny being she had carried for 9 months, this perfect stranger with a shock of dark hair and a fierce grip. Emotion overwhelmed her as the baby's cries softened against her skin. This child wasn't hers to keep, she reminded herself. This had been the agreement from the start. And yet, as the baby instinctively sought her warmth, Elena felt her heart crack open. "Hello, little one," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I've been waiting to meet you." The delivery room door burst open. Alexander stood in the doorway, his normally perfect appearance in disarray, tie askew, hair windblown, face flushed as though he had run upstairs. "Am I too late?" he asked, his voice raw with emotion. "The traffic." His words died as he saw Elena cradling the newborn. For a long moment, he stood frozen, staring at them with an expression Elena had never seen before, awe, fear, and something that looked remarkably like love all mingled together. Slowly, Alexander approached the bed. "Is that your daughter?" Elena confirmed softly. "She's perfect." Alexander moved closer, his eyes never leaving the tiny bundle. "May I?" Elena nodded, carefully transferring the baby into his arms. His large hands trembled as he cradled his daughter for the first time, supporting her head just as they had practiced with a doll during one of Dr. Montgomery's prenatal classes. The moment the baby settled in her father's arms, she opened her eyes, dark, unfocused eyes that nonetheless seemed to look straight at him. Alexander gasped softly, a sound so vulnerable and human that Elena felt her tears return. "Hello," he whispered to his daughter, his voice gentle in a way Elena had never heard before. "I'm your father." The baby responded by grasping his finger with her tiny hand, and Elena watched as the last of Alexander Reed's carefully constructed walls crumbled. A tear slid down his cheek, then another, falling unashamedly as he gazed at his child. "Thank you," he said to Elena, his voice choked with emotion. Thank you for this gift. For a moment, they existed in a bubble of shared wonder, not surrogate and client, not employer and employee, but simply two people witnessing the miracle of new life together. The spell was broken when the nurses needed to take the baby for standard newborn procedures. As Alexander reluctantly handed his daughter over, he turned to Elena, his expression serious. Have you thought about my offer? To stay on as a consultant? Elena looked at the tiny being who was technically not her child but who had been part of her for 9 months. The thought of walking away completely felt impossible now. Yes, she said softly. I'll stay. For a while. Relief washed over Alexander's face. Thank you. I don't think I can do this alone. It was the most honest thing he had ever said to her. Later that evening, after Elena had rested and the baby had been checked thoroughly, Alexander returned to her hospital room. He was carrying a small blue box tied with a silver ribbon. A gift, he explained, placing it beside her. For you, not the baby. Puzzled, Elena opened it to find a beautiful silver pendant in the shape of a mother and child embracing. I want her to know, Alexander said quietly. When she's old enough. I want her to know about you, about what you did for us. You won't just be the woman who carried her. You'll be part of her story. Us. The word hung in the air between them, carrying meanings neither was ready to fully explore. Outside the hospital window, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of promise. And in the nursery down the hall, a baby girl slept peacefully, unaware that her arrival had already begun changing lives in ways no contract could have anticipated. The first month passed in a sleepless haze. Alexander named his daughter Lily, a simple name that Elena had once mentioned liking when they were discussing the nursery flowers. It was a small gesture that didn't go unnoticed. True to his word, Alexander had cleared his schedule. The man who once couldn't be away from his company for more than a few hours now spent his days learning to change diapers, prepare bottles, and soothe a fussy infant. His home office had been converted to a temporary nursery adjacent to his bedroom, complete with a hospital-grade baby monitor that alerted him to Lily's every sound. Elena stayed in her suite in the East Wing, officially employed as a newborn consultant, with a salary that made her previous housekeeper's pay look like pocket change. But the title was merely a formality. In truth, they were simply two people stumbling through the challenges of caring for a newborn. She won't stop crying, Alexander said one night, appearing at Elena's door at 3 a.m., holding a red-faced, wailing Lily. His hair was disheveled, his expensive pajamas spotted with spit-up, dark circles under his eyes. I've tried everything. Feeding, changing, rocking. Without a word, Elena took the baby, cradling her against her shoulder and patting her back in a specific rhythm. Within minutes, Lily let out a surprisingly loud burp and settled, her cries subsiding to hiccupy whimpers. Gas, Elena explained, continuing to rub the baby's back. Thomas had the same issue. Alexander watched them with exhausted wonder. You're a miracle worker. No, Elena smiled tiredly. Just experienced. You'll learn. When Lily finally drifted to sleep, neither adult moved, afraid to disturb the precious silence. Eventually, Alexander sank into the armchair opposite Elena's, running a hand over his face. I never expected it to be this hard, he admitted quietly. Babies don't care about business credentials, Elena replied with a soft laugh. Or net worth, Alexander added wryly. For the first time in my adult life, I feel completely inadequate. Elena studied him in the dim light. Yet you're still here, doing it. Many men would have hired a full-time nanny by now and returned to work. Alexander's gaze shifted to his sleeping daughter. I made a commitment to be present. To me, or to her? Elena asked before she could stop herself. Alexander looked up, surprised by the directness of the question. Both, I suppose, he answered thoughtfully. But increasingly to her. They sat in comfortable silence until dawn crept through the windows. As Alexander carefully took Lily back to her crib, he paused at the door. "Thank you, Elena," he said softly. "Not just for tonight." Thomas visited the following weekend, his reaction to the baby a mixture of awkwardness and curiosity. He stood hesitantly beside the bassinet in the main living room, peering down at the sleeping infant. "She looks like you, Mom," he observed. "Around the eyes." "She's not genetically related to me," Elena reminded him gently. Thomas shrugged. "Still sees you more than anyone else. Babies pick up mannerisms." From across the room, Alexander looked up from his tablet. He had been observing their interaction quietly, a habit Elena had noticed developing, this watchfulness, this studying of how others connected with his daughter. Later, when Elena was preparing tea in the kitchen, Thomas cornered her. "This is weird, Mom," he said in a low voice. "You're living in his house, helping raise his kid, but also working for him. What exactly is going on?" Elena sighed. "It's complicated, Tom." "Are you too?" he began, eyebrows raised suggestively. "No," Elena cut him off firmly. "Nothing like that. We're co-parenting, in a way. Temporarily." Thomas looked skeptical. "He looks at you differently now. And you look at him differently too. We've been through a lot together," Elena deflected. "Having a baby changes people." "Having his baby wasn't supposed to change you," Thomas pointed out. "That wasn't the deal." Before Elena could respond, Alexander appeared in the doorway, Lily fussing in his arms. "I apologize for interrupting," he said formally, though his eyes betrayed that he might have heard some of their conversation. "She's hungry." As Elena prepared a bottle, Thomas and Alexander engaged in stilted small talk about university. The tension was palpable until Lily provided a perfect distraction by grabbing Thomas's finger when he cautiously offered it to her. "Strong grip," Thomas remarked, a reluctant smile forming. "Like her father," Elena said automatically. "And determined like her surrogate mother," Alexander added quietly. The comment hung in the air, loaded with meaning. Thomas glanced between them, his expression softening slightly. That night, after Thomas had returned to university, Elena found Alexander in the nursery, standing by the window with Lily against his shoulder. The baby was asleep, but he continued to gently pat her back, gazing out at the moonlit garden. "I should put her down," he whispered when he noticed Elena. "But I can't seem to make myself do it." Elena smiled, leaning against the doorframe. "That feeling doesn't go away. Thomas was 5 before I stopped checking on him multiple times a night." Alexander looked down at his daughter with a tenderness that would have been unimaginable 9 months ago. "I keep thinking about what Thomas said. About her looking like you. Babies often resemble their primary caregivers, even without genetic connections," Elena explained. "It's nature's way of strengthening bonds." Alexander was quiet for a moment. "I'm glad," he finally said. "That she'll have something of you, even if it's just a mannerism or expression." The words touched Elena deeply, making something flutter in her chest that she wasn't ready to examine. What neither of them knew was that their carefully maintained boundaries were about to be tested in ways they couldn't anticipate, when an unexpected visitor would arrive at the mansion the very next day. The doorbell rang just after 10 the next morning. Elena was in the kitchen preparing Lily's bottles for the day while Alexander was upstairs giving the baby her bath, a task he had recently mastered after several soggy disasters. Jones, Alexander's longtime butler, appeared in the kitchen doorway, his usually unflappable demeanor showing signs of stress. "Mrs. Chen," he said in a low voice, "there's a woman at the door claiming to be the baby's mother." Elena froze, the bottle in her hand suspended mid-air. "What?" "Mr. Reed asked me to inform you immediately while he finishes with Miss Lily," Jones continued. "The visitor is quite insistent about seeing him." Elena's heart pounded as she followed Jones to the front entryway. There, pacing impatiently on the imported marble, was a strikingly beautiful woman in her early 30s. Tall and slender, with long dark hair and sharp features, she radiated a cold sophistication that matched the mansion's aesthetic perfectly. Finally, the woman said when she spotted Elena. "Where is Alexander? And where is my baby?" "I'm sorry, who are you?" Elena asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. The woman looked Elena up and down dismissively. "Vivian Taylor. And you must be the housekeeper turned incubator." Her tone made the words sound like insults. Elena felt as though she'd been slapped. "I think you should wait until Mr. Reed comes down." "Oh, I have no intention of leaving until I see my daughter," Vivian replied coolly. "Alexander used my egg, after all. That makes her mine." The egg donor. The mysterious woman Elena had wondered about during the pregnancy. But something didn't add up. The donor was supposed to be anonymous, with no legal ties to the child. "How did you know about Lily?" Elena asked. Vivian smiled thinly. "Alexander and I have a history. When I donated my eggs to the clinic, I made sure they went to him specifically. He didn't know, of course. A little surprise, you might say." Before Elena could respond, Alexander appeared at the top of the grand staircase, Lily cradled against his chest. His expression was thunderous. "Vivian," he said coldly. "You're trespassing. Is that any way to greet an old friend?" Vivian called up to him. "Especially one who gave you such a precious gift?" Alexander descended the stairs slowly, his body language protective around Lily. "Jones, please call security." "Don't be dramatic, Alexander," Vivian sighed. "I just want to see my daughter." "Surely I have that right." "You have no rights here," Alexander stated firmly. "The donation was anonymous and legally binding. You signed away any claim." "Paperwork can be challenged," Vivian replied with a shrug. "Especially when there's deception involved. Would a judge look kindly on how you manipulated the system to get my specific genetic material without my knowledge of who the recipient was?" The color drained from Alexander's face. Elena took an instinctive step toward him and Lily, placing herself between them and Vivian. "What do you want?" Alexander asked, his voice tight. Vivian smiled, knowing she had the upper hand. "First, I want to see my daughter properly. Then we can discuss the rest." "There's nothing to discuss," Alexander insisted, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. Vivian's smile widened. "My lawyer disagrees. And given our personal history, Alexander, I think a court would be very interested in the full story." Elena looked between them, sensing years of complicated history. "Alexander, who is she to you?" Alexander's jaw tightened. "We were engaged 6 years ago. Until he decided his company was more important than starting a family," Vivian added bitterly. "So imagine my surprise when I learned he was having a baby using an egg from my anonymous donation. The irony is delicious, don't you think?" Elena felt sick. The perfect features of the baby she had grown to love suddenly made terrible sense. They weren't random genetic traits from an unknown donor. They were deliberately chosen, a calculated decision Alexander had made. "You knew," Elena whispered, looking at Alexander with dawning comprehension. "You knew they were her eggs." "Not initially," Alexander said quickly. "I selected based on intelligence, health factors, physical traits. When I saw the profile, I suspected." "And you didn't think that was important information to share with me?" Elena's voice rose with hurt and anger. "It wasn't relevant to our arrangement," Alexander replied stiffly, falling back on formality in his discomfort. "Not relevant?" Elena echoed incredulously. "I carried a child created from the eggs of your ex-fiancé, and you didn't think that was worth mentioning?" Vivian watched their exchange with evident amusement. "Oh my! Trouble in paradise?" Alexander glared at her. This is between Elena and me. Elena, is it? Vivian raised an eyebrow. So the surrogate has a name now. How cozy. Lily, sensing the tension, began to fuss. Elena instinctively reached for her, and Alexander transferred the baby to her arms without hesitation. The natural, practiced movement wasn't lost on Vivian, whose expression darkened. Well, she said coolly, it seems the help has gotten quite comfortable with my child. Elena is not the help, Alexander snapped. She's Lily's. He stopped abruptly. Lily's what, exactly? Vivian pressed, a cold smile playing on her lips. Alexander looked at Elena, who was quietly soothing Lily against her shoulder. The baby settled immediately, secure in the arms that had held her since birth. Lily's mother, he finished quietly. In every way that matters. The words hung in the air, changing everything. Elena stared at Alexander, her eyes wide with shock. Vivian's face contorted with fury. We'll see what the courts have to say about that, she hissed, turning on her heel. At the door, she paused. Expect to hear from my lawyers. Soon. As the door slammed behind her, Elena and Alexander stood in silence, the weight of his declaration and Vivian's threat settling around them like a storm cloud. Elena, Alexander began, his voice unsteady. But Elena was already walking away, Lily held close to her heart, tears streaming down her face. Elena packed her bags that night. With trembling hands, she folded her clothes and gathered her few personal belongings, tears blurring her vision. Lily was asleep in the nursery, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around her tiny life. Alexander had given Elena space after Vivian's departure, respecting her need to process everything. But when he saw the suitcase on her bed, he stood frozen in the doorway of her suite. You're leaving, he said, his voice hollow. Elena didn't look up. I need time to think. Please, Alexander said, a word that had rarely passed his lips before Lily. We need to talk about this. About what? Elena asked, finally meeting his gaze. About how you used me to carry a child created with your ex-fiancé's eggs without telling me? Or about how that woman is now threatening to take Lily away? Alexander stepped into the room, his usual composure nowhere to be seen. I made a mistake not telling you. I was afraid. You? Afraid? Elena's laugh was bitter. The great Alexander Reed, afraid? Yes, he admitted, sinking into a chair. Afraid you'd refuse if you knew the whole truth. Elena stopped packing, her anger giving way to confusion. Why did you do it? Why use her eggs? Alexander was quiet for a long moment. Because despite everything that happened between us, Vivian is brilliant. Talented. Strong-willed. All traits I wanted for my child. And beautiful, Elena added softly. Yes, Alexander acknowledged. But that wasn't the primary reason. It was for me, wasn't it? Elena asked. You chose me as surrogate not just because I was reliable, but because I'm nothing like her. Because there would be no confusion about whose child Lily was. Alexander looked pained. Initially, perhaps. But Elena, you've become so much more than what I first calculated. And now? Elena gestured hopelessly. Vivian wants Lily. She has biological ties. She has resources. What happens now? Now we fight, Alexander said firmly. Together. Elena shook her head. This was never supposed to be my fight. I was supposed to give birth and step aside. That was our agreement. Agreements change. People change. Alexander stood and approached her. I've changed, Elena. Because of you. Because of Lily. It's not that simple, Elena whispered. No, it's not, he agreed. But running away won't solve anything. Lily needs you. The mention of the baby made Elena's resolve waver. The thought of leaving her was physically painful. "And what about you?" she asked quietly. "What do you need?" Alexander took a deep breath. "I need you," he admitted, the words clearly difficult for him. "Not as an employee or a surrogate or a consultant. Just you, Elena." Before she could respond, Lily's cries echoed through the baby monitor. Both of them moved instinctively toward the door. In the nursery, they found Thomas already there, gently rocking Lily in his arms. He had arrived unexpectedly for the weekend, walking into the middle of their crisis. "She was crying," he explained. "Heard everything through the monitor." His expression was serious as he looked between them. "So, some woman is trying to take her?" Elena sighed. "It's complicated, Tom." "Doesn't sound complicated to me," Thomas replied, looking down at the baby who had settled against his chest. "She's yours, Mom. Maybe not by blood, but in every way that matters. And if this rich guy finally has enough sense to see that too, then maybe you should listen to him." Alexander looked at Thomas with newfound respect. "Your son is wise beyond his years." Thomas snorted. "Just practical. He needs you, she needs you. And let's be honest, Mom, you need them too. I've never seen you look at anyone the way you look at this baby. Not even me," he added with a small smile. Elena felt tears building again. "What about Vivian? Her claim?" "Leave that to me," Alexander said with quiet determination. "I've already called my legal team. Vivian manipulated the donation system, which violates multiple protocols. And we have something she doesn't." "What's that?" Elena asked. "Evidence of an established family unit," Alexander replied. "You, me, Lily. Even Thomas. The courts favor existing family stability over biological claims in many cases." "Family unit?" Elena repeated, the words both frightening and thrilling. Alexander stepped closer, taking her hand. "If you'll have us." In that moment, looking at Alexander's earnest face, at Thomas holding Lily with brotherly protectiveness, Elena saw a future she had never imagined when she signed that surrogate contract nearly a year ago. "I'm not going anywhere," she said finally. The months that followed were challenging. Vivian's legal threats materialized into a custody battle that tested them all. But with each court appearance, each evaluation, the truth became increasingly clear to everyone involved: Lily was exactly where she belonged. The final hearing fell on Lily's first birthday. Elena sat beside Alexander, their hands linked as the judge delivered her ruling. Full custody was awarded to Alexander, with Vivian granted minimal, supervised visitation rights that she ultimately never exercised. That evening, as friends and family gathered to celebrate both the legal victory and Lily's birthday, Alexander pulled Elena aside to the quiet of the garden. "1 year ago today, you gave me the greatest gift of my life," he said, taking her hands in his. "Not just Lily, but a second chance at being human." Elena smiled, thinking of how far they had come from that first cold, businesslike proposal in his office. "You've given me gifts too," she said softly. "A family. A home. A future I never expected." Alexander reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. "Speaking of the future," he said, his voice uncharacteristically nervous. Inside was a simple yet elegant diamond ring. "We started this journey with a contract," Alexander said. "I'd like to finish it with a vow. If you'll have me." Elena looked past him to where Thomas was helping Lily toddle across the lawn, her little hands gripping his fingers for support. From surrogate to mother, from employee to partner, her path had been unexpected but perfect in its own way. "Yes," she whispered, as Lily's delighted laughter floated through the evening air. "I'll have you both." The cold-hearted millionaire who had once seen a child as merely a business asset pulled Elena close, his eyes shining with the love he had learned to feel, to express, and to cherish, all because he had hired his maid as a surrogate, never imagining how completely his life would change when the baby arrived.